Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new webinar of the month at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. As you see on the screen, the topic of the webinar is preparing for competency-based interviews. We will be covering what, how, and why competency-based interviews are used in international organizations, and most specifically at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So we do have quite a nice presentation for you today, including some of the theory behind competency-based interviews and also some tips on how you can maximize or optimize your ability to align your past experiences with talking about your potential and fit for the position you're applying for. This webinar is part of a series called the Webinar Outreach Program, which is conducted by the OSCE Secretariat on a monthly basis on different topics. If you're listening now, it's because you either register for the live event or because you received an invitation to participate in an interview with us. If that's the case, congratulations, because we select a percentage of the candidates who apply for positions, certain positions, most positions are quite competitive, and we want to make sure that everyone is or has similar knowledge to compete for positions at the OSCE. And the information you're going to receive today is actually relevant for any position or most positions they may apply at other international organizations. Moving on, since I already started talking, my name is Gustavo Araújo, and I am the Chief of Talent Acquisition here at the OSCE, and I have worked in other international organizations as well, including those in the UN system, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and UNDP, and I have been at the OSCE for the past 2 years, and I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Thank you, Gustavo, and good morning to everybody. And thank you very, very much for being here with us today. My name is Marta Fernández de Matarambroz. I'm Talent Acquisition Officer. I work in Gustavo's team in the Talent Acquisition Unit. I have been with the OSCE since 2013, and I'm really happy to have you here today and walk you through our interviewing practices so that you get a bit more acquainted with our recruitment process.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marta. And Marta's going to walk us through what we're going to learn today.
So today we're going to walk you through what a competency-based interview is and why competency-based interviews are used. What's behind this methodology? We will also walk through what a competency is. So we will trickle down and explain this and what types of questions are considered competency-based. And the fact that not all our questions in our interviews are competency-based. Some definitely are, some are not. How do we recognize competencies from a job description or a vacancy notice? And we will do an exercise there. We will also address how do we answer competency-based questions and how are competencies assessed. We will go through the STAR and CAR, so STAR and CAR methodology, to be able to respond in a structured way to a competency-based question. And we have some best practice tips for you today.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marta. And we're going to move on now to the next slides. Just one thing that we want to remind you, get pen and paper. We're going to give you 30 seconds now if you want to get pen and paper because we want you to take notes. And we also want you to think of some practical examples from your own experience. Obviously, we cannot do this workshop style since we have over 400 people participating right now live. However, it's important that you actually put these ideas into practice. And we're going to start talking about the practice by discussing the types of selection methods that you may be familiar with. Marta, could you read the 3 questions that are on the screen for us?
Sure. So what are the typical selection methods? How about their availability to predict success in the future, what is called predictive validity? What types of methods would be the most accurate?
Okay, so for the participants who everyone has access to the chat, What I'd like you to think about are what are the types of selection methods typically used by international organizations? And I'll give you a hint. One way of selection method is the interview, right? What other methods do people tend to use in international organization? Please use the chat box and I'll read some of the responses that you are providing. Okay, I found written assessment, correct, written tests, online tests, aptitude, um, competition, on-demand interviews, practical tests, recommendations, report writing, group dynamics, collective interviews. Wow, you guys are very good. Verbal, logical, mathematical, reasoning tests. So all of you are very, very familiar with the types of tests, right? Now, what I want you to think is the following. If you are to use just one type of test, okay, which test would you use or which type of selection method would you use to guarantee that you have the best method that would be most likely to predict success in the future? This is question number 2. Some people are putting interview, some people are saying face-to-face interview, some people are saying situational cases, some people are saying written assessment, some people are saying combination. It depends on the type of the position. Very good. Let's look at certain selection methods that you actually have mentioned to me. For example, what is your understanding of the ability of a written test to predict success in the position? If you are to assign, let's say, from 1 to 100, to think about the predictive ability of a written assessment to predict success on the job. From 1 to 100, what would you give me? Okay, some people give me very different numbers here, from 50 to 90 to 25. All right, that's written assessment. How about thinking about, in the past, a lot of individuals used to use graphology, looking at the way that people write their calligraphy to make, let's say, psychological assessments or make assessments of personality. And in the past, not in international organizations, in some individuals may have actually considered graphology to get some information. If you were to use graphology, which is calligraphy, one's ability to write, from 1 to 100, what would you say is its ability to predict success on the job? I see 5%, I see 0, I see 1, I see 55. Okay, let's now go to interviews. And let's talk about a structured competency-based interview from 0 to 100. What do you think is the structured competency-based interview's ability to predict success? I'm seeing lots of numbers from 50 to 80 to 90. Good. So you seem like you're quite familiar with those types of methods. Let's look at some data from some research. As you can see here on the next slides, we have 2 studies that we are quoting. The first study that we are quoting is one called Accuracy of Selection Methods, based on a study by Smith and Robertson from 2001, and another study by Smith and Smith from 2005. As you can see here, ability tests, which are similar to written tests that we do to measure technical knowledge, plus structured interviews, which are similar to competency-based interviews, have a 0.63 predictive ability. In other words, when you put those together, based on the results that we got from the interviews versus future performance or potential performance on the job, we were able to account of 63.63 of the ability of individuals to predict this kind of future success. If you also look at example at personality questionnaires and structure behavior interview, we have 0.40. So when you put these 2 together, or traditional interviews meaning interviews that are not necessarily structured, but they may have the same questions for for the same candidates, but they're not necessarily competency based. So these are at 0.25. This other study here on the right side, which is a study from People Resourcing and Talent Planning by Marjorie Corbridge in 2014, also found that skillful and structured interviews, as well as ability tests, including numerical and verbal reasoning, have zero 0.6 in predictive validity of selection methods, which means that they are more likely than others, such as only using reference checks or only using personality assessment, or in the case of graphology, astrology, or age, which as you can see is zero 0.0, which means it has no relationship with one's ability to do the job. And why are we showing that to you? We're showing that to you to say that the OSCE, like many other international organizations, we use a variety of selection methods to ensure that we give candidates who apply the best chance to show their potential for that particular position. Okay? What we're going to do now is get into more details on how these are used. But before, just a brief summary of what the selection tools that the OSCE uses. Marta, could you read some of the selection tools for me?
Sure. So we have the applicant review, where recruiters review the application form and the cover letter. We also have video pre-screening interviews used through Sonru, so asynchronous interviews. Then we also have anonymous technical tests, written tests to assess the technical knowledge of our candidates. We have competency-based interviews. This is the basis of our interview at the OSCE. And we are using psychometrics testing for emotional intelligence, leadership qualities, etc. And this method is usually used for senior management positions.
Exactly. Thank you, Marta. And now what we're going to do is actually look at what is a competency-based interview. And Marta is going to cover that for us.
Sure. So what is a CBI? They are also called behavioral interviewing. And as Gustavo was mentioning before, these are structured interviews. So they're not open where you actually ask a question, walk me through your experience, but there are several questions to assess skills, knowledge, and competencies. In these competency-based interviews, interviewers ask candidates to please share examples from their past experience when something happened and they had an important action in this specific scenario, and out of this action there was an outcome. So these competency-based interviews are based on the principle that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. If you did something in the past in a specific scenario, most likely you will behave the same. You will do the same in the future. Plus, you will probably apply whatever you learned in the past in order to do a better job in the future.
One thing that's important for you to know as well, and Marta's going to give you details, is some international organizations have different ways to go about their competency-based interviews. Here's what a competency-based interview looks like at the OSCE. Marta.
So let's say you have been called for an interview with us. You are going to either interview with us face-to-face or via video conference. Lately, due to the COVID situation, all our interviews are taking place via video conference. This might change in the future. For now, they are done virtually. Usually, our interviews take 45 to 60 minutes from beginning to end, from the moment where you are introduced to the panelists to the very last moment where you ask for availability and you say goodbye and the interview is done. Usually we have 8 to 10 questions, and we will go through this a little bit later. Not all questions are competency-based. Most of them will be around 6 or 7. Others will go around other parts like technical knowledge or motivation. We will see all this a little bit later. And you will typically have 3 to 5 interviewers. And if you can Go to the next slide, Gustavo. I think here we will see exactly who are actually the board members. Typically at the OSCE, we have 3 to 5, usually 4 board members. You will get to know the hiring manager, so the first line supervisor and yours, a direct supervisor if you're selected. The second line supervisor could also be present in the interview. You will probably have as well a technical expert, somebody who works in the same department who has the technical expertise and can assess this through your answers. And probably you would be working very closely with this person. You will probably see representatives from other departments around the secretariat, for example, if it's a position in the headquarters. This person is usually somebody with whom you're going to work as an internal customer, for example. You will work closely, for example, on projects or things like this. You will also have an HR representative, so one of us actually in that interview, and we are there as voting members. And also we are there to facilitate the process and to make sure it complies with our regulations and rules. And it is fair, it's transparent, and it's objective. You might see one more person, secretary to the board. This person usually does not ask questions, but listens very carefully to what you have to say and what the board members have to say during the post-interview discussion, and will then capture everything in a report in order for this to be presented to the appointing authority. And for documenting purposes, yes.
Thank you very much, Marta. One thing that I want to emphasize that's important as well is the fact that we use interview board members because this decision is not a decision that's taken lightly, and it's a decision that needs to be made via a consensus of the board members. And if there isn't consensus on who or the people who may be recommended for the position, this is also documented in the report. Another thing that's important for you to know at the OSCE and most other international organizations, the board members, the recruitment unit, the interviewers and hiring managers do not make a decision. We make a recommendation. And we typically need to make a recommendation of 1, 2, or even 3 people that will go to the appointing authority. At the OSCE Secretariat, the appointing authority is the Secretary General. In field operations, the appointing authority is the head of mission. In institutions, the appropriate directors. These individuals will get the report that was written by the secretary to the board with the consensus and the agreement of all board members based on a recommendation, and it is up to the appointing authority to decide who should be appointed, and it's his or her prerogative. He or she can choose the first person recommended, the second person recommended, or the third person recommended, should there be more than one. And it's his or her prerogative only based on the fair and consistent process that's been applied to all candidates who participated in the process. I hope that this is clear. We're going to move on to a definition of competency, and Marta is going to give us a proper definition of competency.
Sure. So what is a competency? It's a combination of skills and attributes and behaviors that is directly related to the successful performance of a specific job. So we will see a bit later that we have a competency model with competencies that apply to all staff and mission members in the organization. But each vacancy notice, so each job description, each position will have specific competencies applying to that job. And it's important to identify them in order to predict or anticipate or prepare your interview better. And we will see this a little bit later, how to identify competencies in a vacancy notice. So basically, international organizations use competencies to convey to staff and candidates our core values and the needed talent and skills, and also abilities to perform well in a specific job. And if we take, for example, the example of driving, most of us are very familiar with this action. We need the knowledge, obviously, the traffic, the legislation, the traffic signs, and so on. We need the skills. We need the physical ability to drive, and also the cognitive ability. And we also need the behavior. We need to react to the environment, because every time we drive is a new time that we're driving. We are exposed to a new environment. The advantage of competencies is that they are very broad, but they specifically focus on demonstrated ability to perform a specific job successfully.
Very good, Marta. One thing that's important to note as well is some individuals may actually show similar levels of ability, similar competencies. One of the reasons why international organizations actually have board members recommend people is that it is up to the appointing authority to decide who is most suitable. So in case we have multiple people being found suitable, even if they're close, it's up to the director general, secretary general, head of mission, depending on the organization, to make that decision. And the decision will be made on the report that was written, on the understanding of the needs of the organization, and also on potential other factors such as geographical diversity, gender, or any other factor of relevance that's at the discretion of the appointing authority. Questions should be expected. Marta, you had something to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, Gustavo, maybe just to build a little bit more on what you're just saying, because it's really, really interesting. And it's very important for our audience to know that our panel members are trained for this. So they just don't come into a panel room, into an interview room, and just start asking questions. There is a proper pre-discussion on exactly what the hiring manager is looking for. There is also a review of the questions, who will ask what and what exactly we're looking for in each question. There is also a very thorough post-interview discussion where competencies are assessed, and also the level of the competency shown. It's not the same, as Gustavo was mentioning before, to show communication skills at a very basic level than to really show them at a very, very complex level. And obviously, the panel members will look at this too.
Exactly. Go ahead, Marta.
Well, this brings us very nicely into what kind of questions can you actually expect. So at the beginning, you will probably hear questions around what are the skills and talents that you bring to this position. What interests you about this position? So why did you apply? Be prepared for this, because it's an excellent opportunity for you to give a proper introduction to the panel on who you are, why you're so interested in this position, and what you can do for the organization if selected. And in this sense, we have, yeah, Gustavo, you were going to say something.
So you were referring also to like motivation question, right? For example, what interests you in this position specifically? Tell us about why you want to work for the organization per se. And as Marta said, it's very important that you are able to identify how the position that you're applying for contributes to the mandate of the organization. Whether it is a G1 position all the way to director, it's very important that you always link it up to the mandate of the organization per se. Marta, could you give us the example of the biographical question?
Yeah, so walk us through your recent work experiences and background. So how do you feel it aligns with the position you're applying for? So in this sense, what we're here looking for is we're looking for a person with this experience and these requirements and these technical abilities. So we are definitely looking into information you can provide us, which is relevant to this. Many candidates start from the very, very beginning of what they studied and their academic qualifications, and then they go all the way to the experience that they have right now. You may do that, definitely, but if you do so, please do it briefly and really only focus on those aspects that are relevant for this specific position.
Exactly, especially because if you've made it to the interview process, that is pretty clear that your application has been vetted by the interview board members. If you made it through the interview process, you probably already have gone through the SONRO pre-screening interview. So the board members already have some familiarity with you. So your idea is to show how your understanding of your background aligns with the position. We also can have other types of questions. One is a critical incident question. For example, on your application form, it says you took a professional sabbatical. Can you tell us more about that? Or if there are any kind of gaps, or if there are any kind of interesting points within your resume or application form, it's important that board members understand your career and your intentions thoroughly so that they can make a proper evaluation. Marta, could you also give us the example of the technical question?
Sure. So you can be asked to describe your most complex situation in handling the technical aspects of X, Y, Z and how you approached it. And as I mentioned before, it's not only competency-based questions that we ask, but we are also going to want to explore your technical knowledge in a specific position. So obviously, if you apply for a position like such as a legal advisor, there are going to be technical, legal related questions for sure. So do prepare for this as well.
Great. And this is a good segue for the next slides in which we're going to have some exercises as well. So in summary, why do we use competencies? Number one, we use competencies because we know that research has indicated that structured interviews paired with other assessment methods, including but not limited to technical assessments, application review, reference check, psychometrics, they may help board members get a holistic understanding of one's application. And we're using competencies because we want to know how you've demonstrated a competency in the past to predict how you might react in a similar situation in the future. As Marta said very well at the beginning, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. We're going to go dig a little deeper into the definition of competencies. Marta, can you tell us more about that in the next slide?
Sure. So the OSCE has a competency model that was created a few years ago, and where there were experts from all over the organization, together with consultants, analyzing the core competencies that are expected to be seen by every single staff and mission member in the organization. So you will see there in the orange box that the core competencies are communication, collaboration, analysis and decision making, planning, initiative taking, and flexibility. We also have some core values such as commitment, diversity, integrity, and accountability. And as I said, this is really common to every employee in our organization. Some competencies are managerial, and these are specific for employees who are actually managers, who have supervisory responsibilities, and they need to show leadership, strategic thinking, and managing performance. They need to manage the performance of their employees. When you actually check the job description, which for us, what you would see is the so-called vacancy notice. It's important for you to carefully see or try to extract, try to analyze the competencies that are hidden, so to say, there are implicit in the vacancy notice. And Gustavo is going to walk us through this in a moment. And I would say it's also important for you to know that core competencies and core values are there. They can be measured and explored in an interview, but do not just limit yourself to these. As I mentioned before, some competencies are very specific to specific positions, and these competencies might come through questions in an interview as well.
Very good, Marta. And here's an example. One of the examples of a core competency that we have here is accountability. Sorry, it's a core value. So accountability meaning takes responsibility for own action and delegated work. What we are doing here is the following. Board members are going to be looking at positive indicators of accountability and negative indicators of accountability. In other words, given your examples to a specific question that may touch upon accountability directly or indirectly, via your responses, we will be able to make some inferences that may lead to our identification of positive or negative indicators. Marta and I will read some definition of effective accountability behaviors that may lead to positive indicators. The first one is respects and works within the regulatory framework of the organization. Marta, could you do the next one?
Delivers results in line with agreed strategy, time, and budget.
Acknowledges and learns from mistakes in a constructive manner.
Takes into account own strengths and weaknesses and listens to feedback.
Recognizes the impact of own behaviors on others.
Maintains confidentiality of sensitive information.
So there are many ways for you to ask competency-based questions. The idea for you is, as you identify the competencies that may be listed in the job description, or as you derive them from the tasks and responsibilities of the job description, you will be able to think of examples yourself. Let's give you another example. Marta, could you read the definition for planning?
Works towards the achievement of goals in a structured and measured manner.
Exactly. So depending on the job you're applying for, your goal is to think of examples in which you've demonstrated the ability to work towards the achievement of goals in a structured and measured manner. So when you're giving your examples of planning, you definitely need to add structure and what you consider important factors. Let's look at some of the effective planning behaviors that may lead to our identification of positive or negative indicators. Could you read the next one, Marta?
Acts to achieve clearly defined objectives in line with organizational strategy and priorities.
Anticipates potential risks and prepares for these in advance.
Establishes timeframes and sets achievable targets.
Clarifies responsibilities and accountabilities before beginning tasks.
Coordinates activities with all parties.
Reviews, evaluates, and communicates results achieved. So a potential question that could be asked in order to target all of that would be, tell us about a time when you plan an event. What did you do to ensure that the event was successful? Who did you liaise with? What were the difficulties and how did you handle the difficulties? As you answer these questions, the goal of the board members is to look for indicators of effective planning behaviors by identifying positive indicators or negative indicators given in your answer. Just one last example so that we can solidify that knowledge. We have a definition here for flexibility, which means responds positively and effectively to changing circumstances. Marta, could you read the first definition of effective flexibility behaviors?
Sure. So the first definition would be adapts activities and approaches to suit changing work circumstances.
Can change ideas or perceptions based on new information or contrary evidence provided by others.
Identifies benefits for the organization by questioning and improving routine activities.
Responds creatively to challenges, thinking on his or her feet in response to situations.
Reacts effectively and responsibly to difficult or challenging circumstances.
Embraces new work methods and processes. So let's go back to the slide here that has the definition. Flexibility responds positively and effectively to changing circumstances. A potential question that could come up would be, describe a time when you were running a project in which unexpected circumstances occurred. What were the circumstances? How did you handle them? What went wrong? What did you learn from this situation? From a question like that, you might be able to extricate potentially effective flexibility behaviors in which you're going to get the candidate to give you positive or negative behavioral indicators. I hope that this is somewhat clear for all of you. So in summary, the goal of the board members, and they do that individually, is to find out the positive and negative behavioral indicators by looking at the examples from past experiences, from 1 to 10. We're going to go into a specific exercise right now that I'd like to give it a try for you. I'm going to give you all about 30 seconds to read this job description, okay? I'll give you 30 seconds now. Just take a look at this job description and read it very quickly. 30 seconds. Okay, 30 seconds are gone. Let's pick one of the tasks and responsibilities there. Marta, could you read the task and responsibility number 1?
Assisting in the timely implementation, reporting, and evaluation of project activities.
Perfect. Could you read number 2 as well?
Sure. The second one would be contributing to the organization of needs assessment visits in preparation for capacity building activities.
Perfect. Your job, as you go through the job description, the tasks and responsibilities, is to actually do what we're doing right now, extricating the potential competencies. I know that some competencies may be listed already in the job description, but your role is to make sure that you show the board members that you understand the competencies needed not only for the organization, but for that job itself. And here's an exercise for you. Next, let's look at the first one, assisting in timeline implementation of project activities. Based on the competencies and core values of the OSCE, which competencies could be associated with assisting in timeline implementation, reporting, and evaluation of project activities? Could you enter in your chat box for us to see what you're saying? Good, so I'm seeing a lot of planning. I'm seeing communication. I'm seeing collaboration, strategic thinking, accountability. I see you're listing a lot. All of them could be correct. However, you also need to think about what is the core, most important factor that they may want to assess based on this particular task and responsibility. And it could be planning. Why? Because it's talking about assisting in timely implementation, reporting, and evaluation of a project activity. So a question that may come up from there is, please tell us about a time in which you assisted in the implementation, reporting, and evaluation of a project. What did you do? What was your role? How did you go about that? What may have gone wrong? What could you do differently? Marta, could you read the second task and responsibility?
Yes, so this one would be contributing to the organization of needs assessment visits in preparation for capacity building activities.
Exactly. So what would that be? In your opinion, what kind of competency could be associated to that? Please enter in the chat box. So I'm seeing a lot of analysis, collaboration, communication, decision making. It could be many elements of these, but you also need to, in understanding the job description, pick up the one that may be most related to what they want to. So if you're trying to conduct a needs assessment for visits in preparation for capacity building, it could be planning. It could also be data analysis, right? Because you're also dealing with analyzing data and gathering information and finding what's important. So a question that could be related to that would be, could you guys help us? Could you help Marta and I come up with a question that would actually assess this particular section of the competency within this task and responsibility? Can some of you enter a potential question for this second bullet there in the chat box? I'll give you a hint. For competency-based questions, you can say, give us an example, tell us about a time, or describe your experience with. So someone wrote, give us an example of a time when you contributed to the organization of needs assessment visits. What did you do? What was your role? How did you go about that? What were the lessons that you learned? Okay, so as you go through the tasks and responsibilities, you can learn more about that. Marta, I know I'm throwing this last minute on you, but I don't want them to get tired of hearing my voice. Would you please give us some of the examples of how you can practice before interviews?
Sure, Gustavo. So as Gustavo was mentioning before, reviewing tasks and responsibilities will help you understand better what would be expected from you if you're selected for that specific position. And through reviewing these tasks and responsibilities, especially action verbs, and we will see this in a minute, you can identify potential competencies which would probably translate into creating potential questions that you can prepare for before the interview.
Very good. Thank you for that, Marta. One exercise that we encourage people to use is what we call the T exercise. It's pretty much what you see on the screen. You draw a T to the left, you add the tasks and responsibilities. Then you identify the potential competency. Then you create a question that will be associated to that potential competency. I'll give you an example next. Assisting in timeline implementation, reporting, and evaluation of project activities. And we just already covered that. What's a potential question? We know that is a planning type of question. What is a potential question? Describe your most relevant experience in assisting on a project. What were your responsibilities? How did you add value to the team? Marta, could you read the next text and responsibility again?
Sure, Gustavo. So the next task and responsibility will be the following: organizing project events, so preparing agendas and events materials, selecting participants from state authorities, civil society, and international organizations, liaising with participants and partner organizations, assuring their input, and ensuring the smooth running of the events.
Exactly. So you can associate multiple types of competencies in here. Marta, could you read a potential question?
So a potential question out of this task and responsibility could be, give us a recent example of a time when you organized an event. And pay attention to recent example, because most probably you will want to pick an example from your recent past experience. How did you go about it? What were the factors you took into consideration? What were the unexpected issues? And how did you handle them? And you see here that although this question has many sub-questions, usually they follow the same sort of structure that we also will see in a minute.
Very good. Thank you for that. And let's look at another example as well. Supervising and managing the performance of an administrative assistant hired to support the project. Now it's your turn. Can you guys give me some examples? First of all, let's identify the competency. What competency could be associated to this? Managerial, correct. So it's a managerial competency. Collaboration, so it's a supervisory. Good. Now that you identified, you extricated the competency from the task and responsibility, what kind of question can you ask that will target not only the overall competency, which is management, but also the task and responsibility in question? Can you give me some examples of a question? And if you're shy, you can just send that in. Okay, please tell us about a time when you had to supervise a project staff. What went right? What went wrong? What would you do differently? Very good. Another example that we had here, and I'll tell you why this is not necessarily the best. What could be your routine to supervise an administrative assistant? We do not want to use could or would because they are hypothetical. Let's not forget that competency-based interviews, they need to be about past experiences. So instead of saying, what could be your routine to supervise an administrative assistant? A better question would be, think about your most difficult project. How did you manage your support staff to ensure that the project was successful? What did you do right? What do you think you did wrong? And what would you be doing differently? So Marta, could you read a potential question next?
Sure, Gustavo, and maybe just to mention to what you just said about the would and the could, it doesn't only lead you to a hypothetical question or a hypothetical answer, but it usually leads you to a response that does not give you a concrete example. So this potential question that I will read now will make candidates have to think really of a concrete situation. Tell us about a time when you had to supervise support staff. What type of project was that, and how did you manage performance?
Exactly. And as we mentioned before, the role of the board members is individually to capture what you're saying based on your examples and try to identify whether the behavioral indicators for that particular competency are positive indicators or negative indicators. And that's how they do their mental rating from 1 through 10. And that's how they have a discussion about their impressions on the answers that are given during the interview. We are now going to move on to another active section in which we're going to be talking to you how competencies are assessed. And I'll move it on to Marta.
Thank you, Gustavo. So there are many theories and many ways of actually looking at competency-based questions and competency-based answers. And usually they follow the same structure. They have been defined as SMART or STAR or CAR, depending on the different elements that we will be looking for in a specific response. But basically, the structure is the same. So in SMART, we have a situation. It's a scenario. You need to explain what the situation was, when, where something happened, the mission of the role of that specific person, of the candidate, the action that that candidate took in that specific scenario, the result or the outcome of that action, and very important, the teaching ability. So if that person is confronted in the future to this situation, what will this person do? Not only what this person did in the past, but also building up on it to actually improve it a little bit. No, so this is the structure that we look for at the OSCE. We also have the STAR, which is very, very similar with situation, the task or the role or the position of the person, the action that that person took, and the result. And at the OSCE, although we use the STAR, we also usually finalize a competency-based question with what did you learn and what can you do differently? This is why I mentioned the element of teaching ability. And finally, we also have the CAR, which is the simplest, so to say, but where the structure is the same, we're looking for the same, it's just more condensed. So we're looking for a context where something happened, the action of the person. We're not so interested in the role, but what exactly that person did and the result of that action.
Very good. Some other people may even use what they call PAR, problem, action, result. It doesn't really matter. The goal here in the case is regardless of what you use, whether it's SMART, STAR, CAR, or PAR, is for you to show that the past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So for example, in the case of STAR, we look at situation, what was the specific event, task, what was the task to be accomplished, action, What did you actually do? Your role, not just the team, but yours, and results. What was the final result and outcome? And the same can be said as well as described by Marta as in CAR. One question that Marta is going to run for us next is, how can I prepare? And we're going to be giving you some examples of what you could do. And this requires literally some work and some exercise, because it's not just showing up. Recruiters and interviewers can tell when you are making it up on the spot. A lot of people may say, well, but those competency-based interviews, people can lie or people can make up. We typically can tell because as we ask follow-up questions, we are asking for details that you may not have thought in advance. And it's always important for people to be truthful in the examples that they give. So, Marta, the first preparation, could you give us this tip?
Sure, Gustavo. So as Gustavo mentioned, absolutely do prepare for these. Not only because well, you cannot just make up something, obviously, but also because you might just have a total moment where we just are blank. Your mind is blank and you cannot think of any example. Whereas if you have actually been thinking of some scenarios, some situation, something that happened where you had a specific role and an important role, these will just flow into your mind when you're asked the question. Don't think that the questions are just so tricky that you will not have an example. If you have prepared, they will come to your mind when you're asked. So think of real examples where you have demonstrated competencies in the past and make sure that you had a specific role there. We hear very often very relevant examples of something that happened, but where the role, your specific role, was not so relevant. And so whereas the situation is very strong, if your role is not that strong, that competency is not going to be assessed as positively as others. So do think of real examples where you have demonstrated something. Use this structure, this star or car or whatever you want to call it, method to structure your answers. And it's not only about very briefly saying, this happened, this is my role, this was the outcome, but really using it as a structure, as a skeleton that you will then beef up, so to say. Use the star as a structure, but fill it with relevant and substantial details. And use action verbs. And these are very powerful in English language. With one verb, you're already probably explaining most of what you did. So do use these. Use a variety of them so that you're eloquent and your language is rich, and you use a lot of different verbs to explain what you have done to emphasize your role.
And I'll give you a personal example, like when individuals are asked about their webinar experience, right? A lot of the times, a question you may get is, what's your experience with presentations? A lot of people may say, yeah, I've conducted a lot of presentations. One thing is to do that. Another thing is to say, I have developed, I have designed, I have conducted, delivered, and I have assessed the data on presentations that I've delivered. Meaning that from A to Z, you're covering all aspects associated to the task at hand. So it's really important that you consider that. We also know answering questions in that manner can be sometimes difficult for some people. Some people may come from cultural backgrounds in which they may be more collectivistic rather than individualistic. Other people may have a personality that makes them more likely to answer in we rather than I because they're afraid of sounding a little bit too full of themselves or putting themselves on the spotlight. There is some research that also mentions that there could be gender differences when it comes to actually answering these questions. What we are trying to tell you in advance is this: our interviewers are trained to recognize that, and they're also trained to ask follow-up questions such as, okay, I understand that you're mentioning what the team has done. What we would like to hear is, what was your role? What was your impact? And when we ask you these questions, we're not to put you against the wall. We don't want to do that. We don't want you to betray maybe your cultural proclivities, your personality traits, or whatever it is that you find naturally difficult in answering these questions. But we want to make sure that we give you the possibility to be at the same level as anyone when it comes to emphasizing your role. Because after all, when you join for a job, you're working in groups, but you also have accountability for your efforts. So it's important that you demonstrate and you recognize that you understand the importance of your role in any activity you've had in the past. So that's why we want to make this a special mention in this webinar. Marta, could you read again some of the steps people can take in order to prepare?
Yes, so again, remember to review tasks and responsibilities, and out of this, try to identify potential competencies. And here I would also mention that we do not usually do it, but other international organizations do mention the competencies that are needed or sought for in a specific position. So you might find other vacancy notices in other international organizations where this is mentioned. Does not mean that you are going to get only questions on those competencies, but they do give you a bit more information there. We actually do not mention them in the vacancy notice, but you can find them in our competency model. Out of this, create potential questions. Create them yourself. Just think of all the possible questions they might ask you and how you're going to answer, and think of relevant examples. Relevant and also genuine. Be very stick really to reality, to what exactly happened, and also honor the complexity of that specific example, and consider the level of the position you're applying to is not the same level of complexity for a competency that will be expected for a P1 than for a director's position.
This is very well put. A lot of people may feel like they've given good examples of a certain competency, but a lot of the times they may not be up to the level of complexity for the position. And that's why they leave with the impression that they did well, when in fact, for the position specifically, there wasn't necessarily the best interview. One thing that's important, and Marta has mentioned, and she's going to talk briefly about that, is it's important to use action verbs. And we actually teach folks when we are giving workshops on preparing job applications for the OSCE or any other international organization. It's important that you use action verbs when you describe the way you do your job. So Marta can run a few examples of action verbs for you.
Sure. So we have, for example, the scenario. You're a manager. Tired verbs, or verbs you should avoid using, are led, motivated, managed, enforced, organized. Why? Because they're used all the time, and they're going to have a less of a wow effect than if you use, for example, orchestrated, chaired, programmed, operated, spearheaded, collaborated, commissioned, advised, headed, delegated, or established. So it's just a little bit of a different thing. Maybe some of them are synonyms, but they're used less, and they will have much more of a wow effect than if you use the usual ones like led, motivated, managed, and so on. Another scenario. Yeah, sorry.
Well, no, go ahead, Marta.
Another scenario would be, for example, you working directly with clients. So verbs that we usually use all the time are talked, supported, dealt. Action verbs that you can use that will be more powerful will be advocated, or fielded, or consulted, or arbitrated, mediated, informed, resolved, interfaced, updated, unified, motivated, explained, guided, facilitated, clarified, or enabled. Do you want me to continue, Gustavo? Or
I think we can stop from now so that we have more time for exercises, if that's okay. But one thing you can do is actually go on Google. You can always look for action verbs, right? And as Marta said, some verbs are kind of overused, and it's okay to use them, to have them overused. But it's also important that you understand that the way that you describe how you do your job says a lot about what are the aspects of your job that you understand more or less. Some people may argue, well, native English speakers have an advantage in there because the working language is English, but it's not just a matter of having native-like or high-level English. It's a matter of understanding the intricacies of your job to a point that you can describe it and articulate it in a more sophisticated manner. Would you have anything to say about this particular slide, Marta, or can I just skip?
No, Gustavo, I think definitely that these kind of documents can be found anywhere in the internet. Do go through them and do practice a little bit in using these kind of action verbs, because they are very, very powerful and very telling.
Very good. And you can use them as well in obviously describing, having your job descriptions, and planning your job application. And if you want to learn more about how to plan, prepare a job application for the OSCE or international organizations, all you have to do is go to jobs.osce.org/webinars, and then you're going to find our tutorial there as well. Now let's talk about communication. Communication is one of these competencies that you find in any and all organizations, right? Part of actually handling communication could be dealing with difficult people, managing conflict or related matters. What I'd like you all to do now is the following. I would like you to grab the pen and paper that we talked to you at the beginning of the tutorial. And I want you to think about what is the toughest conflict you've helped settle? And why was this particularly tough? And what we want to do is the following. We want to walk you through a example that could be given at an interview. Obviously, the example is cooked and written in a way that's a little too perfect. Nothing is perfect in life, right? But we want to give you an example that's a little too perfect so that you can frame your mind in the right way to answer these questions, okay? Don't forget as well, you may want to actually write down the way that you can answer. In this case here, we're giving SMART as an example, but you can choose to answer that as a CAR, context, action, result, or STAR, situation, task, action, result, or PAR, problem, action, result. Okay? Marta, could you read the definition of each question for SMART?
Sure. So the S corresponds to situation. What was the specific event or task? And try to give here a time and a location, where, when something happened, which organization, which year. The mission, what objectives did you see as the key issues to resolve? What was it there that had to be resolved and you had to take an action? Action taken, what did you actually do? Results achieved, what did you actually achieve as a result of your action? And the teaching, the teachability, what did you learn from this experience that you will probably use the next time if you're confronted with a similar situation?
Very good. And a good hallmark of a candidate who is able to learn from experiences is also to phrase their experiences with a lesson they learned in the end. A lot of candidates may be afraid of questions that may say, tell us about a time in which you felt that your leadership skills failed you. Or tell us about a time in which a project that you coordinated wasn't successful. Don't be afraid of these questions. As long as you are able to, obviously within reason, not put yourself in an overly negative light, but understand the mistake, tell what you did to correct, own the mistake, and tell us what you learned. This is what we're looking for in this type of question, which is an indication of people who are self-reflective, who are able to conceptualize their work experience, who are able to learn from the mistakes, and who are able to move forward. The first thing I want you to think about is the following. Think about a time when you had to manage conflict, when you had to manage a difficult situation between colleagues, okay? Now, what I want you to do is to write down a brief description of a specific event in which you had to resolve your conflict. You can write down on a piece of paper. If you're bold enough, you can also write on the chat box, and we can potentially read a few examples. If you want us to do, just write it in the chat box. I have an example here. It's a project management for Roma integration project. And it seems like a colleague was overloaded with work. So this is the situation, and the work environment was quite difficult. Do you understand what I'm going? I'm going to give you 30 seconds for you to think of your own situation. 30 seconds. Okay, now Marta, could you read the kind of like prim and proper example given here on the screen?
Sure, Gustavo. So this would be the situation. I was working on a project with two colleagues who just didn't get along. The situation got so bad that they weren't communicating and it was affecting the quality of work being produced. The project manager was avoiding addressing the issue as he said it wasn't his place to intervene. As I kept missing key performance indicators, the situation became increasingly untenable.
All right, so this is the understanding of the situation. Now let's go to the next question. And the next question is mission. What objectives did you see as the key issue to resolve? Now, I want you guys to think about your situation and think about the mission. For example, in the case of the individual who mentioned the project, the Roma integration project, and overloaded work in difficult work environment, what would be the mission in that case? So think about that, and you guys think about the mission, what you need to objective for you to resolve the issue yourselves. I'll give you 10 seconds just to jot down. Okay, Marta, could you read the mission on the screen?
Sure. So this is the mission. If nothing were to happen, I knew that the project would fail. Even though I wasn't in charge, I decided to see if I could assist my colleagues work through their differences.
Very good. So you see, this was the objective. Now that we are walking through your example, let's think about your action. What did you actually do? I'll give you 10 seconds to jot down a few words and a few verbs of what you do to accomplish your mission in that specific situation. 10 seconds. All right, Marta, can you read this one? This is a long one.
Yeah, indeed. Sure. So this is this is the response to what did you actually do. The first thing that I did was to speak to each of my colleagues alone over coffee. I wanted to see if they would open up to me and reveal the cause of their tension. I found out that both felt that the other was not pulling their weight. Both resented having to pick up the extra work. After this, I reviewed the project management plan and noticed that some of our team's roles and responsibilities were not clearly defined. I created a revised plan and submitted it to the project manager for consideration. Once the project manager had agreed to the changes, I asked him to call a clear the air meeting where new roles and responsibilities could be discussed. And here I would ask you to draw your attention to the word I, which is expressed many times through this response, where you are actually focusing on what you specifically did and your role.
Very good, Marta. Thank you for emphasizing that. We cannot emphasize that enough. Now let's look at the results. What did you actually achieve given the situation in which you were, the mission, the objectives you wanted to accomplish, the action that you took? What were the results that you achieved? I'll give you 10 more seconds for you to write down in your own example. All right, now let's go. Marta, could you read the results in this example?
Sure. So, although the meeting was tense at first, once agreement had been reached on the defined roles and responsibilities, some of the tension seemed to go. The next day, I invited the whole team for lunch, and we slowly started to get along better as a unit. The pair who had not got along previously even managed to say a few words to one another. Over the next few weeks, the early phases of a new working relationship started to develop for the team. While it is not as strong as it could be, they are communicating regularly, which is helping the team get back on track and meet their key performance indicators.
As you see here, we're wrapping up the story. So these are the results obtained. And then to finalize, it's always important that you think about the lessons learned. So thinking about your specific situation with the objectives that you wanted to achieve, with the actions that you actually took, with the results that you obtained, what did you learn? So I'll give you 10 more seconds for your own private personal example to write down your lessons. There you go. Marta, could you read this example?
Yes. So the last part of our start would be the teachability. This experience has taught me the importance of having clearly defined roles and responsibilities in team's project plan. It has also helped me realize that good teamwork is the responsibility of every team member and not just that of the project manager.
Exactly. So the idea for this is the following. In any interview situation, especially if you're given the opportunity to have pen and paper on you, as you answer every question, what you can do is the following. When you get the question, you may ask, may I have 30 seconds? Your goal is to write star or car or smart or par and give yourself those 30 seconds to think about some of the answers in advance so you can structure your answer in a coherent and consistent way. We're not telling you to make it up. It needs to be a genuine story. And if you've prepared well enough and you understand the job description and the role well enough, you will have walked through not only the minimum requirements, but also going through the competencies that you assume are related to the position, dissected the tasks and responsibilities, identified the competencies, created potential questions, and thought in advance about potential answers that should have the same level of complexity as the job advertised. I know it sounds like a lot, but this is something that you can learn to do over time. There are some mistakes to avoid, and we are almost we're going a little bit over time. We have about 10 more minutes, and I want to highlight a few mistakes to avoid, and I'll have Marta actually help me with that. Can you elaborate a little bit on this first one, Marta, since you've already touched upon this quickly?
Sure, Gustavo. So one of the most frequent mistakes we actually hear in interviews is this focusing on the team efforts only, which is obviously very nice and is very collaborative to really say we did, we said, and so on. The problem is that in this specific situation, an interview, we are going to hire you. It's only you and not the rest of the people who contributed to that specific situation. So we need to know what you specifically did. And this is why you can always say, I was working in this team. This is what we all did. But then please do focus on, and then my specific role was this, and my specific action was that. So always focus on your impact.
Very good. Another mistake to avoid is demonstrating lack of self-reflection. It's important that you demonstrate your ability to reflect upon your experiences and let your interviewers know what you learned and what you would do differently. It's important that we actually are looking for people who can grow over time, and it's impossible not to make mistakes. It's impossible not to receive negative feedback eventually. It's impossible not to fail. The most important is what is it that you do if and when you fail? Let's go to the next one. Marta, could you give us some tips on this one?
Sure. So if we hear unstructured and irrelevant examples, and with unstructured, we we mean that where the star is mixed up. The person starts with a role, then the person continues and deviates and goes to another example, comes back, continues with the situation of the first example. There's no proper chronology. This is an unstructured example, which will just make the panel members feel totally lost. And also irrelevant examples that have absolutely nothing to do with the competency we are trying to explore, and or nothing to do with the position you have applied for. So do please try to look for relevant examples to the position you have applied for. This is why you need to tailor them to this specific position and structure them, as we said, with this star or car or par, as this will really help board members actively listen to you and follow you. This is what I would say, Gustavo.
Very good. We're going to touch a little bit upon non-verbal behavior, but we also want to be very explicit with you about the fact that the OSCE, as an organization, places a lot of emphasis in training their interview board members or raising awareness of potential implicit or unconscious bias. Just in the month of February, for example, the Secretariat had an entire month dedicated to reducing or mitigating the potential effects of implicit bias by having chats, articles, podcasts, messages distributed across the Secretariat via email, and workshops. And this is also part of the training that we conduct with all interview board members. One thing that we do as well is actually prime the board members before interviews by showing small short videos about the potential impacts of implicit bias, particularly against minorities, against women, against people with disabilities, against people who may not necessarily come from an individualistic background and refer to we rather than I. So this is also part of nonverbal behavior in the sense that this is coming from you and not from the candidate. And nonverbal behavior is also something that we are paying attention as well, because it does impact the kinds of assumptions that we may make about you. So Marta, could you elaborate a little bit about nonverbal behavior?
Sure, Gustavo. So as Gustavo was mentioning, nonverbal behavior says a lot about you. It's not only what you're saying, how you fill this interview with words, but it's how your nonverbal behavior actually accompany those words. We don't have a specific dress code or a specific, personal presentation, but obviously appearing in a neat way will definitely, create a good impression. The positioning as well, the positioning and also the posture, the last element that we see there, are definitely very important and tell us, well, if you feel secure about what you're saying, so it's you know the situation well, you have prepared well for that specific question and for the interview in general, and you feel comfortable conveying the message, the verbal message, through nonverbal behavior. Eye contact is very important, and I'll give you a tip here. Some candidates just look at the first line supervisor, the person who is going to be the supervisor, or some only look at one specific person who just asked the first question and then is always that person. So make sure that you actually establish eye contact with everybody. That is a constant thing, and that this also will motivate your panel members to continue actively listening to you. Facial expression, bring a smile. It's not supposed to be an interrogation. It's just supposed to be an hour where we actually get to know you a bit better. And if you smile, you will probably get a smile back. And it will definitely ease possible tension and nervousness that you might have.
Can I say one thing here too,
sure,
Martha?
Sure,
quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah, bring a smile. But if you're not necessarily a very smiley person, don't do it, because then we will tell that it's a little dishonest or ungenuine. So you also want to make sure that you present yourself. Go ahead, Marta. I'm sorry to interrupt there.
Absolutely, Gustavo. Yeah, and I fully agree with you. Of course, don't force the smile, but if you're the smiley type, do it. And if not, no, you just be. What we mean by this is just relax as much as possible.
Yes.
and be yourself.
Yes.
The voice production is also important. A monotonous tone, a very low or very slow or too fast, is not going to make your interview performance as strong as if your voice is is constant, is eloquent, it goes up and down a little bit. It's a little bit, it just creates and raises the interest of the persons that are listening to you. Think that those board members will probably have 4 to 5 interviews that day. That's 4 or 5 hours of listening to people. So the more interactive and the more interesting you can do it through an interesting, tone in your voice, the better. And the posture I mentioned already, Gustavo.
Very good. So now we just have about 2 slides to finalize. I have this one and Marta has a brief summary. There's this really interesting article called Reappraising, Get Excited, Reappraising Pre-Performance Anxiety as an Excitement. And the idea of this article and this psychologist is that it's very common for people to be anxious in interview situations. I get nervous, Marta gets nervous, our boss gets nervous, directors, director generals, anyone can get nervous. And the feelings of nervousness are not very different to some extent as feelings of anxiety or excitement about things. So this psychologist actually recommends that you frame anxiety as excitement. Prior to the interview, adopt that opportunity mindset. What is it that you're doing? You are demonstrating to interview board members your desire to join the organization. You have something to add to value, a value that they want as well. You have been selected out of potentially hundreds, in some organizations, thousands of people, and you made it all the way to the interview cut, which means that you've gone through other types of processes, including sono pre-screening interviews or written tests or the applicant review. That means that you are also there to give us an opportunity to get to know you. So it's a two-way street. A good way to actually reframe anxiety into excitement is reviewing the job description, particularly the tasks and responsibilities, identifying the potential competencies associated in the tasks and responsibilities, anticipating the questions by creating them, and they should be competency-based questions, and thinking about real life genuine examples that reveal the level of complexity that you have on that particular competency, and also be ready for both technical and non-technical questions. So this is just to summarize. Use these strategies that we have shared with you today to better prepare so that you can be better able to frame that usual nervousness, which is very common, very normal, into anxiety about interviewing. Marta is going to give a brief overview before we finalize and we go back to a few questions. Go ahead, Marta. It's a repetition, but it's worth it.
Thank you, Gustavo. Sure. So first of all, remember to identify the relevant competencies. Don't just go through the interview thinking of, okay, what kind of things they can ask me. I don't know. I don't even remember the vacancy notice and their requirements. Do think about the relevant competencies, and this is done through what we have seen, the exercise we have done with Gustavo, which is reading their requirements, and the tasks and responsibilities, and extracting possible competencies from there. Our competency model is public, so you can definitely use it as a reference and for preparation. Think of specific examples and structure them. So typically think of 10 situations, for example, from your past experience that are relevant, and structure them. Put, as Gustavo said, on a piece of paper, STAR, and just really describe there what happened, what your role was, what you did, and what was the outcome. And believe me that if you really have those examples in your mind, they will come to your mind when you're asked a specific question during the interview. No matter how nervous you are, they will come, surely. Prepare also an opening statement. So you know that most, if not all, interviews usually start with, okay, tell me what you can bring, what have you learned, what is your background, and why you have applied. So really prepare this, because as it's probably a very, most probably this question will come. You can already have a proper response there that really creates a very good impression. And the last but not least, practice and practice and practice. Not only if you're invited for a Sonro interview, for example, an asynchronous interview, but also for a live interview, a face-to-face, do practice, because you will just leverage, your performance interview much more than if you don't.
Very good. Let's just to the questions now. A question that I received was, how do we approach questions for which we have no experience? What I tell you is the following. If you have no experience regarding the question, you have to say that. However, what you can try and find out is, what are examples in which you may indicate transferable skills? For example, if you do not have experience with dealing with high-level authorities, but you do have experience in coordinating across departments, use that as your springboard to show what kind of skills you have that would be useful in that situation. You also have to be mindful is, it's not that you should just apply for jobs for which you qualify 100%. That's not the case. You also need to give yourself a little breathing room, because interviewers are also looking for potential and not just for fit. So that's important as well. Okay. Another question that I'm going to ask Marta, since I'm seeing the question here, is, Marta, do you recommend asking the board questions at the end of the interview? What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I would definitely ask questions to the board. The board is usually very interested in hearing from you, and through your questions, we will provide you information. Of course, we will respond to the questions, but we will definitely learn a little bit more about you. We have sometimes questions from candidates who are, they want to know about the team, or others that want to know a little bit more about a specific project the OSCE is working on in a specific region, for example, or they want to know what their specific role would be in a specific task that was announced or indicated in the vacancy notice. And so through this, we definitely get to know you a little bit better. And we are very happy to respond to your questions.
Yeah, very good. But just don't overdo it, right? Just a few questions at the end of the interview are fine. More than 2 or 3, that can be a little much, because the interview board members are most likely waiting for the next candidate to come. Okay.
Also,
Go ahead, Marta.
Yeah, sorry, Gustavo, to interrupt, because it's true that in the timing, it's something that I forgot to mention before. Well, we mentioned at the very beginning that the interview is usually 45 minutes to 1 hour, and we usually announce to you at the beginning of the interview how many questions we will have. So based on this, you just need to make a very fast calculation in your mind, how many minutes you should dedicate to each question. 2 to 3 minutes is the typical thing. And also consider this towards the end of the interview, because as Gustavo said, the panel is usually waiting for the next candidate to come. Yeah.
Another question I have here, Marta, where can we find a list of typical standard questions related to each competency and core values? Maybe you could share the compendium. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the compendium, so apart from the competency model, we have a compendium of typical questions that are asked by the OSCE. Not only the OSCE, there are many other international organizations that actually share their compendium with the public so that they can prepare. I'm not sure, Gustavo, if this can be found in the internet, but otherwise we could think about putting it in the website, just putting some typical questions that we ask. But please do consider that by no means these are the questions that you will get in an interview first. And by no means are these the only questions that we will be asking, so to say. So you can find competency-based questions not only from the OSCE or the, I don't know, other international organizations. You can find competency-based, thousands of them in the internet, and you can practice with these. But as I said, do not just think that just because you have practiced these are the ones that you're going to have in an interview.
Very good. Let me find 2 more questions so that we can move forward, because we've gone over time as well. Any specific advice for entry-level candidates? Marta.
Sure. So interlevel candidates, you mean
Like with no
P2s,
experience or
P3s?
very little. I would even say P1s
Yeah.
and barely P2 because you need a few years, right? So
Yeah. Sure. So I would recommend you to, when you're actually going to the interview, having a very good overview of your application form and the experience that you have. If you don't have a lot of professional experience, make sure that you use relevant examples from when you were studying or you were doing your PhD or your master thesis or something like this that is relevant to that position, that can actually help panel members understand where you which competencies you have and the level of complexity you have been confronted with, so to say, in each of those competencies. Make sure that well, that you understand that in these positions, most probably you will be having a close supervision of your supervisor, and you will be mostly contributing to projects or activities together with other members of a team. And you definitely will have to go through these kind of experiences and how you contributed to the work of a team.
and the last question I have here, you have explained very clearly how to answer competency-based questions and how they are assessed. Could you elaborate on the answers to motivation and biographical questions? What I'd say to that is the following. On the motivation, it's very important that you understand the mandate of the organization. If I am interviewing a candidate for the OSCE and the candidate says, "Oh, I want to work here because I am really excited to become a monitoring officer in Ukraine, and I know that that's what you do." And they have another candidate who may say, "I am a big believer in the comprehensive approach to security, and I really understand how important it is to actually have different efforts in the political, military, economic, environmental, and the human dimensions to make sure the participating states can work towards consensus for security of Europe and its neighbors." Those are very different answers. I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but they have different impact on interview board members. As for biographical questions, think about how you present your biography in a coherent way that aligns with the position advertised, meaning there is a reason why you're applying for the position rather than just looking for a job. Because as you may understand, for certain positions, let's say a P2 or P3 at the organization, we may have upwards of 600 candidates, and we have to actually look through everyone to come up with a long list and find out who meets the minimum requirements. And it's very important that everyone understands that just because you meet the minimum requirements does not mean that you should be interviewed, because you're competing at the same level with people with different levels of experience. Our role is to make sure that we identify, based on the application form, the top candidates who meet the minimum criteria, send it to the hiring manager and the board members. It is up to the hiring manager to decide who to shortlist, not recruitment, and then we move forward to other aspects. Obviously, we take into consideration geographical balance, gender distribution, and other factors. But in the end, the role of recruitment and the role of the interview board members is to issue a report with hopefully two or three suitable candidates for the appointing authority to decide. The decision is not ours. The decision rests with the appointing authority, who can use his or her sole discretion based on the report, based on his or her understanding of the needs of the organization, based on geographical diversity factors, based on gender factors, and based on factors that are relevant to him or to her only. Okay? We are close to the end of this presentation. I want to make sure that you can check out our applicant resources at jobs.osce.org, and you can find information on our webinar. I would also recommend you check our infographics on recruitment in 10 steps and sign up to our talent acquisition newsletter that goes out every month with tips for candidates like you. On behalf of Marta and I and the Talent Acquisition Unit, we want to say to the 800 people who registered for this event and to the individuals who are listening to this recording right now, we very much appreciate your interest in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. With that, we say goodbye and we wish you the best, and we're looking forward to seeing your applications in the future. Have a nice day and talk to you later.
Goodbye.